Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Government Affairs Forum. My name is Grace Waltz. I am the Vice President of Public Policy for the Minneapolis Regional Chamber. A few housekeeping notes this morning. As you enter the meeting, all attendees will have audio and video muted. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your toolbar for questions to be considered by our speakers, and you can also communicate with the host using the chat feature. Also, this webinar is being recorded and you will receive a link to the recording in your post-event email. I just want to take a moment before we get started to thank our sponsors. We really appreciate your support. A special thank you to CenterPoint Energy, the Minnesota Timberwolves and Minnesota Lynx, the Minnesota Twins, Mortensen, Target, Wells Fargo Bank, and Xcel Energy. Now I will introduce our speakers. Today, we are joined by Brianna Biersbach, reporter for politics and government at the Star Tribune, Caroline Cummings, reporter with WCCO TV, and our host is Brian McClung, co-CEO and senior principal for Park Street Public. Brian, I will hand it off to you.
Hey, thanks, Grace. Thanks so much to the Minneapolis Regional Chamber for putting on this conversation. We're really excited to have such a great crowd joining us this morning to talk about what happened in the 2021 legislative session and what is still to come, because as you all know, the work is not done and the legislature is kind of behind the scenes working on things as we speak. And we'll have a special session coming up next month to hopefully resolve the work of the 2021 legislature and wrap that up prior to the June 30th deadline for the end of the fiscal year. So as Grace said, I'm joined today by two great state capitol reporters, Caroline Cummings with WCCO TV, Brianna Biersbach with the Star Tribune. Carolyn is new to our market. She came here from after reporting in Iowa for 3 legislative sessions, where she will, of course, tell us that the Minnesota legislature is much better and we are, much smoother operation, hopefully, than Iowa. And certainly when she gets to see our state fair, she will recognize that it's better than the Iowa State Fair. Brianna spent more than a decade reporting at the state capitol now, Star Tribune Star Tribune and Minnesota Public Radio, Mesabi Daily News before that as well, right? MinPost, that's right too. So many things we've all worked on together. And before I moved over into public relations and public affairs, I spent 6 years as the spokesman for Governor Tim Pawlenty and as his deputy chief of staff. So we've all been around the Capitol and many capitals for a long time. And happy to have this conversation with you. As Grace mentioned too, we want to take your questions, so feel free to put those into the Q&A at any time. I've got a handful to start off the conversation, but we'd love to talk about what you're interested in learning about this legislative session and what's coming up. So at any point, just drop those questions into the Q&A and we'll get to those as we go. So I just want to start off really broadly and get both of you to kind of give us your key takeaways from the 2021 session. What did you see kind of at the beginning of the session when we started in January? This, of course, is the first session where we started off largely remote with most of the hearings and most people meeting by Zoom and other technologies and, how that impacted things. And then, of course, last week, the governor and legislative leaders announced that they had a budget deal, but it was really just that, a framework for the numbers and where the money would be spent. But there's really still a lot of thorny policy issues to be sorted through and some real, tough areas to find agreement on that remain. So, Brianna, why don't we start off with you and give us kind of your overview. What were kind of the key things that you saw happen in this 2021 session?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me today. I'm always happy to be part of this group, in person and virtually. I think it's the last, since COVID started, the session, the 2020 session, the 7 special sessions that happened after that, and now this one all kind of blended in together to really be the COVID session, really, for me, and I think a lot of others. It was remote. There was a lot of fights over masking policies and how to handle, crafting an entire budget and an entire, and how to get through an entire session when most of the legislators are not actually physically in the building, and the public is almost completely shut out of the building, and still is. We expect that could change before the special session, but and that has really been, it's sort of been fascinating to watch how they manage trying to include the public, how they try to craft policy without the usual pressures they have, giant rallies or people flooding into testimony rooms wearing, shirts or carrying signs. All of those normal pressures are gone, and they are still, taking on big issues like what should the budget look like? What emergency power should governors have in situations like this? About police reform, what should be done when the federal government sends the state billions more than they usually send, which they do send money every year, but billions more on top of that to help, with the current crisis and now beyond, when we look at the sort of less restrictive money that is starting to come into the state now. So it's been unlike anything I've ever covered in the last 10 years. I'm sure everyone would say that it's been like a year and a half in anyone's life. But it's been fascinating to watch how it has kind of interacted with the legislature. But really, everything has kind of come down into this nexus of, kind of boiled into this nexus of COVID. There are other issues that happened, but really the focus has ended up around the pandemic, responding to the pandemic, and other things could potentially fall away, because of disagreements and because of this big elephant in the room. How do we respond and how do we recover from the pandemic?
And Carolyn, we've done our best to welcome you to Minnesota, but it's kind of hard under the circumstances. So curious to get your kind of first impressions as a new political reporter here.
Well, it's been very interesting, obviously, because for all those things that were just mentioned, right? That this session is conducted in a way that's not typical. Being a political reporter is the foundation of that is relationships and forming those relationships with the key players. And for me, it's been difficult or strange to acclimate myself to a place that, I don't get to have those face-to-face interactions. And also the person whose shoes I filled, Pat Kessler, has obviously been a mainstay here for a very long time. So it's been interesting, but like everything that was just said, right? COVID has dictated this session from how it was conducted to the policies that are being hashed out and kind of the sticking points between both chambers and both parties, obviously, because that's in divided government what it looks like. So it's just been interesting to see how COVID touches just about everything. I mean, we already felt that in our daily lives, of course, but to see it shape government it is really interesting. And also, I think too, for me, maybe the famous last words of Governor Walz were when he said, special sessions don't really seem all that special anymore. And that's been a completely new concept to me, because in Iowa, special sessions are extraordinarily rare, in that I didn't see it in my 3 years there. I'm good friends with people who have been haunts of that building in Des Moines much longer than me and can count on their hand how many times that's happened. So to come into a place that every single month there was a special session, now that's obviously governed by Minnesota statute of emergency powers needing to be authorized by the legislature, but still just to think that it became a de facto year-long legislature is interesting. And just that they kind of waved their white flags towards the end of this session that, you know what, we're going to have a special session inevitably. And even Speaker Melissa Hortman kind of posing, now it would take many years and many procedural elements to do this, as I understand, including a constitutional amendment, but floating the idea that maybe it's time to change the way our legislature operates in terms of having a part-time legislature that needs to end by this constitutionally bound date, because as we get, larger, we have more, as she put it, like, you don't drive the same car you did in 1973. That's just been interesting to kind of navigate that and understand too, a 2-year budget instead of passing a budget every session for the next fiscal year. Those are just some kind of little things that have made it much different and it definitely interesting and feel like you're building the plane as it's flying. But luckily, the colleagues in the press corps are very helpful and great. So yeah, I think just COVID dictating policy, and also too, we'll get to this, police reform. We're the session's happening in the biggest trial, arguably of the century nationwide, but certainly the biggest in Minnesota history, and how those events are dictating the conversations at the Capitol too, and how it's not, excuse me, you don't exist in a vacuum, and how all of those surrounding elements that are large events in our world are dictating how lawmakers are acting in St. Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe sticking on that topic of the impact of COVID on this session, I'm interested to get your takes a little more about both the policy impact, right, which might be to narrow the policy that is tackled by the legislature because it's harder to take on maybe more complicated or larger issues under the circumstance, but also the personal impact of preventing legislators from spending time together. And really that seems to have been over the years the way that some of these disagreements get hashed out, that those personal relationships are formed, and that sometimes they go into conference committees that meet for 14 hours straight and really spend time working through issues. And we haven't seen that under the format that we're operating now. So curious to get your thoughts about that COVID impact, in both directions there, and also on your reporting, and how does that impact your reporting and your ability? You can't just grab a legislator in the hallway and get a quick comment or get some background information, kind of hear the gossip that's happening around the Capitol. It's much more formal in a way. So I don't know, Caroline, maybe if you could start off with your thoughts on that, that'd be great.
Yeah, so like I, kind of just touched on, I mean, for me coming into a completely new beat in a new state, it's been challenging just because so much of that, like I said, the currency of political reporting really is just making the introductions, people seeing you around, and that's how you build those relationships. Just from a sheer technical standpoint of doing television, doing Zooms with all of the glitches that come with it are just, not desired at all. And just from a visual standpoint. So I will be looking forward to the day where we have fewer and fewer of those, which by the end of session really became more of the norm. People were vaccinated and, the leaders felt more comfortable doing that. I think also too, just from what I've seen in covering, what has become it's been a tense session with the back and forth and the trading of, jabs over policy issues. It would seem that lawmakers too benefit when they are among their peers and those of in person and with those of opposing views. I feel like just in the same way you talk about kids being online and it's easier to say something mean to a classmate on the internet than to their face. I feel like, when they're out of practice of doing that, it can be a little easier to, kind of shout from the rooftops your disagreements. It would seem too that the best work that they've ever done has been when they actually sit in a room and they hash it out. I guess you could even look at finally reaching a quote unquote deal. Of course, like you mentioned, it's just a framework. That took Leader Gazelka, Speaker Hortman, and the governor in a room together for, past midnight, that after that into Monday, that Sunday, that they came to an agreement. So I think that's kind of where people really can get through to each other is face to face. And when you have a situation that basically kind of prohibits you from doing that from a reporting side, but also it would seem from a legislating side, makes it really difficult. And also too, to the point about, just being able to catch somebody in the hallway. Hey, it takes so many more layers to get a hold of people. And as someone who is still building source relationships in this state, it's not like I have my direct line of attack in the way that I perhaps did in Iowa if I was navigating a session in this way. So that's been, just kind of a, technical challenge, if you will. But again, looking forward to next session. I feel like will feel like my first session because it hopefully will feel like a normal session. So I can really get my bearings there.
Gotcha. Brianna, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, I don't want to repeat. I agree with everything Caroline just said. And, I do think that the most progress was made when they actually did sit in a room together. I think it was pretty strained before that. I mean, it's been really challenging for these freshman lawmakers, right? Who I remember on the first day of session, I was wandering around the empty building, basically going to the state office building and finding freshmen who were there for their first day ever serving in public office, some of them, and they just were like, you're the first person I've seen this whole day. And a lot of them navigated the session mostly from home. You know, they don't really know what it's like to really be at the Capitol in kind of in the rush that is. And I think, you know, we all miss it. I miss being able to go up to the House alcove and just, you know, send a note through a page or grab someone when they just walk past me to get a comment. You know, I'm lucky in that I've been doing this for a little while. I have some relationships where I can call people up. I have their cell phone numbers, but even that's challenging, right? You know, I mean, sometimes legislators don't want to talk to you about what you want to talk to them about. And it's very easy to avoid us in this, you know, in this kind of mostly remote situation. So for those reasons and for the public, I'm looking forward to being back. It's been terrible for the public. I mean, there's no doubt that this is the most disconnected they've probably ever been from a legislative session. And think of the issues they would have filled the Capitol for. I mean, the first ever vote to legalize recreational marijuana. There was a small group out front. That would have been a huge group. Some of these hearings on police reform issues probably would have filled the Capitol. You know, you think about tax policy and all these things that would have brought business groups in. There just was nothing like that this year. So I'm looking forward to it being going back to normal, whatever that is. I don't think it will ever be really normal again. And one thing I do want to caution is not to give legislators a pass that this session was hard and COVID was hard. So that's why the budget deal was late. I mean, the budget deal is always late. They did the exact same thing in 2019, basically. They got a deal at the very end, and then 4 days later, they came back, which was probably a little bit more advantageous in terms of actually keeping this deal together. They only had a few days before they had to come back. Now they have a month, so we'll have to see if it holds that time period. But I do think that, you know, what Carolyn mentioned, do we need to change the legislative process? This happens all the time. It happens all the time, and it happened in COVID too. COVID definitely, and the strains definitely contributed to it, but it's also just kind of part of the fundamental, you know, problems with the system is that they have a deadline and they wait till the end to try to get a deal or beyond.
Yeah, and I guess the Department of Administration said the fence around the Capitol is going to come down, I think around June 1st, or they're going to start to take it down then. So maybe it's possible that, you know, when they meet again in special session, it might feel more like, you know, regular. I don't know that they've announced necessarily the lifting of restrictions of public access to the Capitol, all that yet, but they're at least taking the fence down. I assume that's a sign that they're headed in that direction. And maybe it'll feel a little bit more like, you know, a return to you know, some of what, you know, we're used to in the past. Well, let's talk now about, you know, some of these policy issues that we've touched on, but really dive in a little bit deeper. And, you know, you both mentioned police accountability and police reform, and that's really emerged as the linchpin to complete the work of this year's legislature. And as we've talked about, you know, the eyes of the country were on Minnesota during the Chauvin trial. And certainly there's, you know, I think a lot of activity and pressure towards making some reform and making some changes. And I think there's been some areas of bipartisan agreement, but then other areas where, you know, the parties start to diverge. And that's where, you know, it becomes tougher to get a bigger package together. So curious to get your thoughts about what you're hearing on the police accountability front. We know that's a key priority, especially for members of the legislature from communities of color, to really make sure that that actually happens as part of this deal. And so, Brianna, maybe you could start us off and just talk a little bit about, you know, where that is right now and how that fits into the framework of completing this deal and actually concluding the session in June.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing to think about, you know, COVID and the police reform issue and how they've really been the dominating forces of the last year and a half. I mean, 2 special sessions, 2 of the 7 last year were also dominated by the first police reform package that they did agree to And that kind of had taken some of the pressure, I think, off of Republicans in the Senate for some time. For most of the session, frankly, this wasn't a dominating conversation. But then, we were getting closer to the verdict. And then, of course, Dante Wright was killed in Brooklyn Center in a fatal police encounter. And that sort of really reignited the debate at the Capitol and for communities of color and for the people of color and Indigenous caucus in both the House and Senate. They said, look, this in particular stops, right? And Philando Castile also died during a police stop, and these kind of the parameters around when you stop someone, when you don't, really rose to the top, but also so did a dozen other police reform proposals that, groups wanted last year as well, but there was not able to be an agreement around those measures. And they had said, we're going to come back and we're going to want to push for these. And so that really kind of brought it to the top. I do think the verdict and the fact that there was a peaceful response to the verdict in Minneapolis did take some pressure off Republicans in that moment. I mean, Democrats kept pushing, though. They still are. Walz is today meeting with families from Minnesota who've lost loved ones in encounters like this. So I think that there is still pressure. There's still lobbying behind the scenes to get something done. But, the verdict did, I think, alleviate some pressure from the Republican side. And I do also, just the other day, Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka did release a video talking about kind of a string of violent, shootings in Minneapolis over the last month and over the last weekend. And that really to him signaled that it's not actually time for some of these police reform measures. It's that Minneapolis needs more law enforcement. And he did this and he put out a video on it, which doesn't, he wanted this to be out there and known. And this is kind of the danger of saying you have a deal. They didn't have a deal on policing at the end of session, right? They had a parameter for the budget. Gazelka did say, I think there's some things we can get done. We're going to keep talking about it. But now a few weeks later, he's saying something very different. We'll have to see what comes out of that. But I think that his tone has shifted. And meanwhile, there are a lot of new members and a lot of members in the House caucus who just as strongly want to see something passed. So it could come down to this, as you said, whether they can get a deal on this. Does it fall apart because they can't, or if they can't, or does, as it often happens in a divided legislature when things are hard to agree to, do they just do the sort of status quo? They get to a budget, they do a few new things with federal dollars, and then they kind of walk away without anything on this issue, and possibly also the emergency powers issue that Republicans have been talking a lot about. It's possible that's the result too. But yeah, it's definitely, the tone has shifted in the weeks since they announced this broad deal.
Mm-hmm. Carolyn?
I think what's interesting, and obviously too, coming from Iowa, I did not cover a divided government, even though surprisingly Republicans who control both chambers would have a hard time finding deals sometimes on budgets, which is pretty fascinating. But when they came forward with that budget framework, and it was really just that. I mean, it was just, this is the top line numbers of this federal money, where we want to allocate it in terms of broad issues like education, et cetera. There was a lot of talk about, okay, like, should they be waiting till May 28th and June 14th to like sort out the spreadsheets and the deal, because like how fickle this agreement might be. And I think to Brianna's point about Leader Gazelka's video about, this is not the time to be talking about changing policing. Like, if anything, we need more law enforcement on the streets, because look at Minneapolis and the crime that has been skyrocketing there. I just like wonder if, if it was not on terms of the House momentum of trying to get Republicans on board, if this potentially, like this lag, maybe had them lose some of that momentum, because, Paul Gazelka was more amenable to this idea of, there are some things that you're putting forward that we can address. I'm not going to, get to the extremities of like ending qualified immunity or some of those more strict or more, I guess, far left proposals, but that's not even what the House Democrats want to see. It's not in their final list of like a dozen proposals that they said, hey, here's our offer, like qualified immunity, which is a big sticking point, like in Washington, D.C. in that George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. That's not even on the table. Like they're trying to temper it in a way that makes meaningful reform, but doesn't like completely alienate Republicans. So I think that that is going to be something to watch, because as much as it's the linchpin, is it though, if this whole, this past few weeks, it kind of makes Republicans more, adverse to doing something. So I think that should be interesting to follow. And also too, in the Dante Wright situation, which Brianna mentioned, like it reignited the debate. And I found it really interesting that some proposals really came out of the woodwork as like a direct response to that encounter. One about sign and release warrants. So if someone is pulled over, like in the case of Dante Wright, and he has an outstanding warrant for a court date, that you're not arresting them for that. You're having them sign a citation acknowledging that they have a court date, and then they're let go to try to just reduce the chance that something could turn deadly. And also just let's look at how we do traffic stops and conduct them. I know that there's some discussion about if someone has a broken taillight or has something hanging from their rear view mirror. I mean, should that be something that somebody's pulled over for or issued a citation for? So I found that to be really interesting too. Again, to that greater point of what I kind of spoke on earlier is that the events outside of the Capitol dictating what's inside the Capitol, and how legislators want to legislate and feel like they need to directly respond to something that has happened. So I don't think that there has been any public meetings with that public safety conference committee. And I know that there was some kind of frustrations on both sides about like not having productive ones as they did have public conference committees up until that end date. So it'll be interesting to see, what, if anything, that they get done behind the scenes. And if there is a public working group meeting for people to observe that, the final negotiations on those policies, which really will be, I think, the thing to watch by when we wrap up here.
Yeah, the Senator Limmer, Representative Mariani show might have some fireworks if they start holding those, for sure. As long as we're on this topic, we had a question in the Q&A from a participant here too, asking about the violence in Minneapolis and whether or not we think that the governor might intervene. In the late 1990s, Governor Arne Carlson deployed state patrol to Minneapolis when there was an uptick in violence in the city. And of course, had these high profile shootings that we've been talking about, in the warehouse district with 2 people killed and a number of others shot, and then 3 children under the age of 10 who've been shot, innocent bystanders. And of course, the Minneapolis Regional Chamber and other partners are working to put together a reward to try to get information to lead to arrests in those cases. But curious to hear if there's been any sentiment shared with you from legislators or the administration about should the state intervene? Is there something else that can be done, or what they might be looking for? As I think there are a fair amount of concerns that this summer could be increasingly violent, and that's a trend that we've seen accelerating. And we know, in the warmer weather months, that can be an issue. So curious if either of you have heard anything on that topic.
Well, obviously, Mayor Fry did ask for help, I think from federal partners, but as we've seen over the last year, the state often does kind of come in these situations, or has, with the National Guard, with state troopers. The state can marshal a pretty large force if needed. So that is not unprecedented. It actually has happened quite a bit over this last year. I think the mayor needs to specifically ask. I mean, we've also seen over the last year that it has to be It has to be, I need help. And that's sort of how the process actually kicks off. Local partners ask for the help. And then, the governor has been very responsive to that. So I wouldn't be surprised if that is something that ends up happening, especially if things escalate as they could and often do in the summer, in the warmer months. And, I think this is also kind of broadly getting people interested in a broader conversation around juvenile justice and how the state sort of handles, young people who get into the system and maybe don't actually get out of it in the right way. And it starts this cycle. I think that, that is a conversation I'm hearing more and more about that people want to have. And obviously they're looking at police reforms this session, but this kind of goes beyond that and looking specifically at this juvenile system. So yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that happened. I haven't heard any kind of specific buzz about it right now. Everything's been so focused on the budget. Maybe Carolyn has heard something that I haven't though.
Unfortunately, I have not. So I would pretty much just kind of leave it where Brianna had it. I think she said it well, but I know that the governor was asked about it. And, like everyone has been appalled by what's been happening. But I don't think there's been any substantive talk about, what that looks like with any sort of state intervention of the patrol officers being involved.
Gotcha. Okay, great. Well, I want to move on to one other big issue, and that is redistricting. I think it's kind of interesting. I feel like we haven't heard that much talk of redistricting this year, except for the fact, of course, that we got to keep all 8 of our congressional seats, which was a big surprise, right? The pundits, the conventional wisdom was that we were going to lose a seat in this cycle, but we're really good at filling out our census forms. We're really good at getting people to do stuff in Minnesota. And so, we beat New York for that final seat by, 89 people. And I think that, maybe took a lot of pressure off, because the idea of going from 8 congressional seats to 7, that fight, really be, probably pairing up a couple of incumbent members of Congress to run against each other in a primary or general election. We also would lose the federal funding as you drop down a seat, all of that. So I think we're all excited about that. But I think in many ways, the bigger impact is what happens at the legislature over the next 10 years and how those districts changing could impact who's in control of the House and Senate. So curious to get your thoughts about what we should expect from redistricting. Of course, in Minnesota, most of the time our maps are drawn by a panel of judges, because we have divided government like we do now frequently. And so we typically do not have a map that's signed into the law by the governor, but want to get your thoughts about redistricting, what to watch for, and how you think that might impact the 2022 elections and then the legislature moving forward. Caroline, why don't we start with you?
Well, this would be my first time covering a redistricting year, so I'm looking forward to that. I think, well, first of all, I know everyone who's from Minnesota on this call will appreciate that I am learning quickly Minnesota's great pride in its voter turnout and its participation in civic engagement. So very quickly, it was like, we filled out our census forms better than everybody else. Let's just make sure we know that, which I thought was kind of a cute little Minnesota quirk. But I think that even though obviously Minnesota narrowly, probably I actually think the closest it has been in terms of the differential between a state keeping its seat and one losing it, or gaining a seat and keeping steady in like the last several decades, if I recall. But I think it remains to be seen if like what, if anything, New York does to potentially challenge that. I think that there's still some discussion that could happen. As no legal expert, I don't know exactly how that procedural element happens, but as some wise data expert kind of proposed was, or put out there, was that could be the difference of like one person who's collecting census information missing a day of work. 89 people, that being the differential there. So I just think also too, this is kind of a aside, but relevant to what the census kind of produced in terms of our population estimates. Like it almost just, it signals that trend that we're seeing like across the Midwest and the country of like these urban centers seeing like exploding with people, and then the more rural places kind of losing ground. And I'm wondering how that impacts, you know, if we did lose a seat or what our maps look like, how that, you know, would impact that dynamic, and if some more rural places would be consolidated with some of the more urban places. I know that there was some talk about, you know, like Ilhan Omar's district being kind of touched more into the suburbs and what that would look like in terms of her a progressive stronghold. So yeah, I think that was kind of the top line takeaways for me, I suppose. And I know Brianna is much more well-versed in redistricting than I am, so I will punt it to her.
This will only be my second time covering redistricting, and the first time was 10 years ago because we only do this every 10 years. So I've had to remind myself of a lot of how this process works. But I mean, I think as Carolyn mentioned, the first immediate thing is a possible lawsuit from New York. I mean, they could basically find any grounds on which to challenge the accuracy of the count, right? They could say, you know, like, you know, census workers did this wrong. And in such a chaotic year, there probably are ways they could find, you know, there was, maybe they undercounted college campuses, or, you know, maybe they didn't properly count prison populations. So it's very possible and very even potentially likely that they could do this. It usually happens when it's not even that close, right? States sue, and it's New York. They sue a lot. So I wouldn't be surprised if Minnesota has that kind of hurdle in the near term. But in the even nearer term, usually by now we would have block level data. So this is the down to the really minute data that you need to draw maps. We would usually have it by end of April. We're not getting it until I think the latest is end of September. So obviously the legislature couldn't do anything this year. They are going to be starting earlier next year. Usually they start in February. They're going to be starting in January, they announced. So that gives them a little bit more time to try to take basically a stab at drawing these maps, right? As Brian mentioned, it almost always goes to the courts because we've almost always had divided government when the maps are drawn and they don't agree. But constitutionally, the legislature draws congressional and legislative maps, their own districts, which people have said is an inherent conflict of interest, and we should have a redistricting panel. But those have never really gained traction. It's kind of like the emergency powers debate. You don't want to take away your own power. You have to. The legislature would have to draft bills to take away their own power to do this. And people are not in both parties inclined to do that. So, you know, they'll probably take a stab at it. Maybe they'll have some, if there's special sessions, maybe they'll kind of get down to the nitty gritty. We'll have to see. Maybe they'll do working groups in the interim. But it gets complicated next year. Right away, we have precinct caucuses. We have endorsing conventions. You have to file for office by early June. I mean, the courts are not going to have a huge window if this gets punted over to them, which we expect it will, to do this work. Luckily, with technology, you can probably draw 20 maps in a couple hours, right? I mean, technology makes it very easy to draw maps, but there's a whole public process, you know, in terms of getting input about what communities should look like. That just inherently takes time. So it's going to be down to the wire. They might have to delay some, you know, election dates. Legislature might have to consider that. But it's going to be fascinating. As Carolyn mentioned, districts are going to have to change. Even though we didn't lose a district, the shapes are going to change to accommodate population shifts and growth. Some are going to get larger, some are going to get smaller and shift. I'm really watching, you know, what happens with Angie Craig's district, right? She's already in kind of one of these fascinating suburban rural combo districts that makes it for very close elections there. You know, does she grow in a more rural direction? Does she, you know, pull in different parts of the suburbs? Same with, as Carolyn mentioned, Ilhan Omar's district. Does hers get more suburban, you know, or does it shrink in? Well, it'll be fascinating to watch either way.
Yeah, that's great. Well, and so talking about the 2022 elections, you know, of course, redistricting will have a big impact on that. And like we said, you know, especially watching that shift in population from rural parts of the state to suburban or urban parts of the state could change the makeup of the legislature. But also want to think about the governor's race, of course. So in next year, 2022, we have all 201 legislators on the ballot again because we have new districts. So everybody's up. and then the governor's on there with them. So that'll be a really interesting election cycle. Of course, it's the midterm election, which tends to go against the party in power in the White House. So it could be an opportunity for Republicans to, gain some seats. That could be counterbalanced by potentially losing some seats in more Republican rural parts of the state. So curious to just get your early thoughts on the 2022 elections. From my perspective, it feels like the governor's race is kind of off to a slow start. I would have thought maybe there'd be more challengers getting in by now. But of course, that might be due in part to the legislature not being done yet and some legislators wanting to run. So Brianna, maybe we can start off with you. You give us kind of a thumbnail sketch on the governor's race and the legislative races, kind of who we've seen emerge as candidates, who's out there still as possible candidates, and what you're watching for.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be a fascinating year because after redistricting, of course, all of the legislatures back up 2 years after they all were just back, up on the ballot, and the governors. So all of government could potentially change. It's a big question mark. The makeup that we know now could be totally different, after next fall's election. So, I mean, the governor's race is fascinating. No governor has had to run for reelection after closing down major industries, closing down classrooms. I mean, Walz has had to take extraordinary steps in an extraordinary pandemic. And now he has to run for reelection. And people who maybe didn't know him then definitely know who he is now, right? And they have opinions about him. And he has done well in some of the polling we've done in terms of his favorabilities, in terms of how he handled the pandemic. But there are going to be much more people who have strong feelings about how he handled it. And that is, I think, going to be the strong Republican campaign message. We're already seeing that from the few candidates who are in, including former State Senator Scott Jensen, who's a doctor, a family physician. I mean, he is really running on the message that he bungled the pandemic response. We're definitely going to be hearing about that from some of the other candidates. Among the names we've heard, of course, the Senate Majority Leader Paul Gazelka is considering it. State Senator Michelle Benson is considering it. State Senator Carla Nielsen is considering. I mean, those are three people right there who are probably a little tied up at the moment and can't talk about it yet, or haven't been able to make moves yet in either direction. Some people who aren't running, Pete Stauber was someone who a lot of folks were thinking might run. He said he's not. Former Viking Matt Burke was someone who people thought might be in the mix, but he's now kind of part of Scott Jensen's campaign. But the legislative battle is fascinating. It's a complicated map where you put your resources. It's narrow. It's narrower in both chambers after the last election. So it's conceivable that either chamber could go either way, depending on the intervening circumstances in the next several months. But as Brian mentioned, it tends to be a better year for the party that's not in control. So I think Republicans are feeling pretty good about their chances and both the legislative side and even potentially in the governor's race, even though, Walz hasn't announced what he's going to do yet. People expect him to run for another term and has a lot of name ID, more than some of the candidates I'm talking about here. But, it's really just anything can happen in this world, as we've all learned over the last year.
Of course, we've got two independent members of the Senate right now, Tom Bach and David Tomassoni from northern Minnesota. And Tom Bach has run for governor as a Democrat in the past. And I think sometimes people speculate that maybe he'll take a swing at it as an independent. We could have an interesting three-way race. Carolyn, any thoughts on the election cycle ahead and kind of what you'll be looking for in particular?
Well, Brianna touched on this a bit, but this idea that it's a COVID referendum election, I think that that's going to happen here in Minnesota, but it's also going to happen in states across the country. So, kind of measuring the success of that message. So from Republicans, and it's going to vary state by state. So in Minnesota, it will be Republicans arguing against, the governor's powers and thinking he went too far. And then for perhaps the governor who, made these choices and signed the executive orders, it's, I did this in your best interest, the health of the state. And so you're going to have like very far apart messaging and just dueling over COVID in a way. I mean, clearly once in a lifetime pandemic, we did not have a pandemic, a few years ago. when this would have, another governor's race opportunity. But I think that that's going to be super fascinating. And also too, just even at the local legislative race level, I mean, we know that down the ballot candidates, people fall off sometimes when you get to the, they might know more of the top ballot people, and then maybe care increasingly less as you get down to the more local level. And I wonder if COVID being such a polarized topic kind of buoys those people a little bit, or makes those more hyper local races more interesting, because you've got state lawmakers who have been really outspoken about COVID and restrictions, and passing bills in states across the country to, limit authority of governor's powers, or, make that the whole topic. I mean, we've seen it in Minnesota. The emergency powers issue has been probably the number one sticking point for Republicans, and something that they've been talking about since day one, is the emergency powers, and feeling like the governor ought to relinquish those. So I think that the COVID issue, like we've mentioned, and how it dictates the legislature right now, it is really going to dictate these races. And I'd be curious to see how, for the congressional districts and those congressional races, if that is as much of a sticking point. And I say that because, votes on federal COVID policy feel a little bit more disconnected than, at the state level, and obviously with the governor's race specifically, since the governor kind of had most of that authority to dictate what Minnesota looked like. So just curious how that, overarching pandemic theme kind of impacts races across the state, and we'll be certainly looking for if every other issue gets drowned out in the governor's race specifically, and if it really is just reliving this past year and a half about what the governor did and did not do, and Republicans really trying to hit hard against, his policies on the pandemic.
Yeah, interesting. Well, good. Well, I want to get to a couple of the questions here in the Q&A that people have sent in before we get to the top of the hour. The first one I want to ask you both, a question from Robert Freeman. He just wants to know your take on how likely it is that the deal that legislative leaders and the governor have made falls apart. And I would take that to mean, by falls apart means we push into a potential state government shutdown, that they're not able to work something out by June 30th. And we see ourselves in that difficult spot that we've been in, twice in the last 20 years with at least a partial state government shutdown. So I don't know, Brianna, do you want to take that one first?
Well, yeah, we all asked the leaders this when they announced this deal. They're like, we have a deal. Here's kind of what's in it. Here's some numbers, but we have to figure this all out, and we're going to probably do it before June 14th. And that was that's a lot left undone. And when we know these things can hinge on the smallest or the biggest, difference, right? In which there are many in a divided government. So, I mean, they expressed confidence that the deal would hold, but I just, I think that that's kind of the issue when three people get into a room and make a deal, and they don't necessarily, they kind of know that their caucus is behind it, but they, when it comes down to votes and what can happen in a month in the world, look at the last year, I think that, I think that it could fall apart. Anything could happen. It could take longer. They could come back on June 14th because the governor is expected to extend his emergency powers, which would automatically bring them back. And they might not have the deal really in hand yet. And they might need to take another week. And suddenly we're getting very, very close to June 30th. I could totally see that happening. The problem is we don't know enough right now. All of this is happening behind the scenes. I've had conversations with legislators throughout the week who are saying they're meeting and constantly every day, trying to hammer out the details. Some areas are going well, other areas are quiet. I think anything could happen. And I think that's a risk you take when you hatch a deal behind closed doors with three people and you leave a month until you actually finalize it.
I'll just quickly add that I think the government shutdown is absolutely not desired at all. And Paul Gazelka specifically has said that, at worst, he would like to see like a lights on budget. So just keep like status quo, and I'm not quite familiar how it would go in Minnesota, but I know Iowa has been in a position before with the pandemic last year, just like, let's pass status quo funding, just two months, and it expires in August. This was August 2020 when they came back in June when they were on pause. So if Minnesota could do something like that, I don't know what exactly a status quo budget looks like for a biennium, but it seems clear to me that they do not want to get to that point. But like Brianna said, I mean, never say never. And it is, really the three of them at the end of the day. And they still do have really big hills to climb, I would say. It's not just because they had a global budget agreement really doesn't mean anything until they, get some of those spreadsheets worked out. And then also just all those policies that we've all talked about that are still very much not sorted. So.
Yeah, it just seems like it'll be that pressure between not getting everything that you wanted or having a state government shutdown. And that's right when you get to June 30th and you say, well, we didn't get these policy things that we wanted or asked for, but on the other hand, we really don't want to have a state government shutdown. So let's do the basics and live the fight in the 2022 session. I mean, they already said some of the federal money the state is getting, they're going to push to the 2022 session and spend it then. So, which is really unheard of, right? Say like, well, we won't try to spend all the money we have. We'll put some of that aside and deal with it next year. So I could see some of these policy issues getting the same kind of treatment, and then legislators using that pressure of, well, we wanted to avoid a shutdown at all costs as a way to get beyond, the upset from their base or their supporters who wanted to see those things. I wanted to do this quick question from our Q&A. I thought it was interesting, just about your work personally. And a person asked, how challenging is it to report impartially without expressing your own personal or political beliefs? And I think a lot of us as observers have felt like there's a lot more opinion in journalism and Twitter and all of this kind of, it all starts to blend together. And so recognize that maybe it's, and there's some desire to have some of that, right? And have reporters who are more active in that way. So that's part of it. But curious from your perspective as, political reporters here, what do you do to kind of keep your own beliefs out of it, or how hard is it to do that? So Carolyn, do you want to start out?
Sure. So I always say, because, people, especially like my peers who are in their, mid-20s like me, have a lot of strong opinions about politics. And I always say that I'm an apolitical political reporter. I really truly in my own personal views is very independent. And so I think that helps me because I don't feel so strongly in a direction. But also too, it's just, just checking yourself. Your job is not to say how you feel on a topic. And when I'm reporting on government, it's, what's the issue at hand, what are the competing ideas about it, and what are the facts? Because, if we do a he said, she said, of course, someone could say X and someone could say Y, but then there's Z, which is like what the policy does and what its actual impacts are. And so, not to say that journalists aren't infallible. We make mistakes, and people, no matter how you do your due diligence to be as fair as possible in getting both perspectives, both sides, there's always going to be somebody who is upset with your reporting or what the headline says, which, most people don't realize that the reporters often don't write the headlines. So I think for me, it's just like, I got in this business because I just felt very deeply about holding powerful people accountable for their actions, no matter what party they are in, no matter what side of an issue they are in. So, that's going to be holding like a Republican governor accountable in Iowa, a Democratic governor accountable in Minnesota, and, not playing favorites or, any of that based on like are they an R or a D? Because at the end of the day, they both wield a lot of power and they are elected to serve the people of their respective states. And so my job is to do the best I can to distill fact from fiction and hold people accountable. And when you're taking stories outside of the Capitol to, how they impact, trying to consciously think about how, elevate voices who aren't fully represented often in media or the voiceless. I mean, it's like the old adage, right, is comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. And I think that is, if you're going to do your best work, is a good words to live by, because those people in power have that, they have that position, and they are, head in the sand if they think that they aren't going to be asked tough questions, but then handle with care people who are, those more voiceless people who don't wield that power, and be delicate in doing that. So, yeah, it's kind of just how I try to approach it, is always for my best foot forward, as fair as possible, but also, the telling the truth in the most accurate way and the most fair way possible.
Yeah, I'll be brief. I agree with everything Carolyn said. And I think it's hard for people I think people get into political reporting, and maybe it's true for some people, it's not for me, but I didn't become a political reporter because I'm political. I became a political reporter because I think it's a great beat to, like Carolyn said, hold people accountable. And when I focus on why I do this job, it's not because I believe in one issue or another, or I have all these opinions. It's because I want the public to fundamentally understand its government. I want them to know what their government is doing. I want to tell stories, the people who come into the building and those who don't, but have stories that are still being debated in the context of policy. I want to make sure those are centered when we talk about what lawmakers are actually doing, right? Because at the end of the day, they're doing this for the public, for the people of the state. And sometimes they forget that in all their bubble worlds. And it's sort of our jobs to always center real people's voices and go out and make sure that is, hold accountable lawmakers and make sure that the work they're doing is both visible to the public, accessible to the public, understood by the public, and in sort of the public's best interest. Sometimes the public disagrees about what's in their own best interest, right? But we have to make sure they understand what they're talking about and why they're talking about it and what's at stake. So when you think of it like that, it's really not hard to do this job and not tweet something about some opinion you might have. That's not really what motivates me and all my colleagues, from what I understand.
And just,
perfect. Well,
just quickly tag on.
Go ahead, Karen.
Sorry, I think that the understanding part is so important, because just talking to you guys, you understand that, like, I'm still learning how this government works, and I have covered government before. How scary is it for the average person who is trying to navigate the legislature's website or know how to participate in a public meeting? So I think it's incumbent on journalists to demystify that for people, because at the end of the day, government is working for you, or should be working for you. So let us help you understand how that is working for you.
Right. Perfect. Well, that's a perfect place to leave it. So thank you all for joining us. I'm going to turn it over to Grace for some housekeeping notes to wrap up, but we really appreciate you all taking the time. We hope to see you at another one of these events sometime in the not too distant future. Grace?
Thanks, Brian. And thanks so much to Brianna and Caroline for a great conversation. If you haven't already, make sure you register for our next Critical Issues Forum, which is Pandemic Impacts on Women in the Workforce. And that will be June 3rd from 8 to 9 a.m. Again, thanks so much to our wonderful sponsors, and thanks you all for being here. Have a great rest of the week. Enjoy your Memorial Day weekend, and we hope to see you soon.